Good morning, everybody. How many of you were at the party last night? Yeah, well, thanks for making it out. I know first session, morning after the party, rainy day. So the title of this talk is Dynamic Teams, Fluidity for the Win. If that's not the session you wanted to be in, now might be a good time to find the session you wanted to be in. I am Doc Norton. I am the CEO of a company called CTO2, and we offer coaching to organizations. We do a lot of agile rescues, so companies that tried to go agile, something went wrong, we can come in and help them figure out maybe there's a way to do things that works for you but doesn't come out of a box. Some of that involves leadership coaching and even working with HR. But one of the things that we keep seeing as we go into these organizations, especially those that have made an attempt to move to Agile, is this belief that teams have to be stable. Right? We'll talk to them about maybe increasing the fluidity of the organization. Say, no, we can't do that. We have to have stable teams. We have to. Okay, where'd this come from? So, well, it says it in the Scrum books, and most of us these days think Scrum is Agile, so therefore, it must be true, right? But, okay, great, it says it in the Scrum books, but why? Why do we need to have stable teams? What is all this about? Are any of you familiar with Tuckman's stages of team development? I got a couple of hands up. Several of you may actually be familiar with it and just not realize that it had a name. So the most common response that I get from leadership for why teams need to be stable all kind of maps back to this basic theory, Tuckman's theory of team development. And what Tuckman told us in his theory was that teams go through various stages. As a team is actually coming together, they will go through these stages in sequence. Teams must go through these stages. They will go through them one at a time, right? And if there are any challenges, the team will regress in those stages. And those stages are forming, storming, norming, and performing. Does this sound familiar to more of you now that we've... Yeah, okay, so that's Tuckman's theory, right? Tuckman came up with this theory in 1965, right? And as I said, he says that all of these phases are necessary, they're inevitable, a team will go through them. And what happens, according to Tuckman's theory, as a team goes through these, is we see varying levels of performance on that team. So, as a team is first forming, and you've probably experienced something like this, as a team is first forming, everybody is actually kind of cordial. Nobody's really being their true self quite yet, right? You're feeling out everybody else on the team, trying to figure out, what do they value? Why do they do it that way, right? Everybody's just kind of being nice to each other. So performance isn't too bad. It's not awesome, but it's not bad. And if you could stay there, you'd be an okay team. But after a while, it starts to actually just piss you off that guy never writes a good commit message, or that she keeps putting the curly brackets on the wrong line, or right, whatever it is that just kind of gets to you. And so you bring it up. And it turns out that that's maybe personal for that person. And so now what happens is the team starts to go into this phase that Tuckman refers to as storming. And in storming, what's happening is now we're starting to show our true selves. And we're starting to have real conversations, but they're hard conversations. And while that's happening, our performance goes down, right? Because now we're fighting over all kinds of standards or having heated debates, discussions over all sorts of things that we do. If we can get past some of the emotional pieces, we then move into norming. And in norming, what happens is now we're having more civil discussions. We're starting to reach compromise, understandings, standards. The team starts to agree where the curly brackets go. The team starts to agree how the commit messages are supposed to be written, right? And all of that kind of noise starts to fall away, and we move into performing. And now you have a team that is performing well. The challenge So actually, so the graph should look something, like that. It's beautiful, right? And as I said, how many of you, just quick show of hands, how many of you have joined a team and have gone through something that feels sort of like this? Okay, so most of you, right? And so that's actually the thing, is we hear Tuckman's theory, and then we map it to our own reality, and we go, that sounds pretty reasonable. I think I've experienced that. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? But what if that's wrong? Right? What if the problem wasn't at all because of Tuckman's? Right? What if there was something else going on? Because in my experience, when I actually watch teams, this is what we say happens, right? But oftentimes the reality looks a little bit more like this. We spend an awful lot of time in this storming thing, sometimes way too much time in this storming thing, right? Or it seems like there's this continual loop that happens. We just keep regressing back, right? Which on a timeline actually looks, more like this, right? And many of those teams go through all of this, but the performing doesn't quite look like that. It looks more like where we started when it's all said and done, right? So when we hear about Tuckman's and we kind of map it to our own experience, in the beginning we go, yeah, that sounds right. That's familiar. But then you start to think about what's actually happened for me. And it's kind of sort of like Tuckman's, but not really, right? Now, it turns out that Tuckman's theory, which is basically just this hypothesis, right, was based on a 1965 review of 55 articles on team development. Right? Now, most of these articles were personal narratives written by members of the team that Tuckman himself had asked them to share their experience. And in the way that the question was asked, there was a lead. And so many of those narratives mapped to this idea because it was planted in their head already. So 65, this theory comes out. 1966 through to 2011, dozens upon dozens of various studies done to test Tuckman's. Not one ever validated Tuckman's. Several of them showed this can't possibly be right. None of them ever came close to actually validating it. Right? Now, I don't know about the work that's been done in the last 5 years, but that's an awful long time span to have all of these studies done and all of them basically saying something's not quite right here. In 2011, the U.S. military did the largest study in history on this particular topic. And they looked at many different teams under many different contexts. And what they did was they took all of these behaviors that should appear during forming, storming, norming, and then performing, according to a very comprehensive, Tuckman's model is now, it's called a model. It was never a model when he did it, it was just a theory, but people kept adding onto it until it became known as a model, and there's all this stuff around it. So they took all those behaviors and they said, okay, let's observe all these various teams, and let's actually map when these behaviors occur and see what really happens. And what they found was not that curve that we see, not the linear sequence that is supposed to occur, but something that looks a lot more like this. Teams very rarely go through all 4 stages in sequence. Most teams do not experience all 4 stages. The stages clearly overlap massively, right? And the most significant part about this, storming is the red. This is what happens in reality. Teams are constantly storming. It may be subtle, but a healthy team is continuously reevaluating their process and discussing, should we continue doing that? Should we do this? Should we try this other thing? And that fundamentally is the behaviors that are exhibited in storming. And it turns out that that doesn't really affect performance in any quantifiable way because it is a constant occurrence. So the number one argument that I have heard as I go into organizations for why we need to have stable teams is wrong. If the reason we need to keep the team stable is so that they don't regress into storming, but storming is a constant, therefore there is no regression, it's wrong. But I will admit that stable teams are valuable in an awful lot of organizations. So if the problem wasn't because Tuckmans, which we've clearly seen at this point, maybe there's something else that's going on. And I think maybe the problem was because resources. Now, what do I mean when I say because resources? How many of you work in organizations where they refer to human beings, living, breathing people with minds and souls, as resources, as if you were a pencil or a lump of coal? I think this pervasive resources mentality is what's actually hurting most of these organizations. So let's look at this. So here's our pile of resources, right? Nameless, faceless, they're just movable cogs. I need stuff done. They are stuff doers. Awesome. I happen to have a large pile of projects that need to get done. Now, as an executive, I could think about these projects and decide which ones are actually the most important to the organization, which ones give us the greatest strategic advantage, which ones would actually provide maybe the highest return on investment, be that perhaps cash or some other kind of outcome that I'm looking for, right? And I could prioritize these things, and I could invest in a few of them, and I could see how that goes, and I could readjust my investment strategy based on the actual outcomes. But that's really hard work, and I have a pile of resources. So if I can just figure out some way to get them to do all of that, I don't have to make hard decisions. And lucky for me, I figured out a way to do that. I will just assign people to multiple projects. And if I can assign all of the projects across all of my resources, then all of my stuff is being worked on, and therefore all of my stuff will get done, right? It's not quite how it works, though, is it? How many of you have been on more than one project at a time? Yeah. Do you feel super productive when you're on more than one project at a time? You might feel super busy, but do you feel super productive? Well, it turns out that every time, basically, let's take a look at this. If you are assigned to a single project in a 40-hour work week, and I'm assuming 40 hours as a standard work week, it turns out that the reality is there's about 8 hours that just go to stuff and things, right? You are about 80% efficient on any given week. Now, it might be getting coffee, it might be taking a restroom break, it might be a smoke break, it might be whatever it is, right? But the reality of it is, in a 40-hour week, if you're actually tracking all the hours, about 32 of those are actually applied to work in some way. That's a reality. We can lecture people, we can do whatever we want about it. That's an actual reality. So when you are on 2 projects, you lose 20% of your time to context switching, right? So this is not micro stuff, but macro stuff. I'm thinking about this project and the team members and the context and the business need and where we are in terms of status. And now I need to set all of that aside. I need to find some way to compartmentalize that over here and not think about it because now I need to work on this thing, right? That switching of context, which unfortunately for most of us happens within a day multiple times when we're on more than one project, causes costs about 20% of efficiency. So if you're on 2 projects, you're getting 24 hours worth of work done in a given week, which means you're putting 12 hours to each of those projects. And you can kind of do the math here, right? 3 projects, 4 projects. What happens at 5 projects? At 5 projects, mathematically, all of your time is spent either on stuff, things, or switching between projects. You technically never get anything done. Now, I know lots of people that have said, no, that's not true. I'm on like 7 projects and I'm delivering things all of the time. Sure, you are getting some things done, but for how long they take and for how few you actually complete compared to what your throughput would be if you were just on 1 project, mathematically, you're almost at 0, right? This is asymptotic. You're not going to actually get to 0. You'll do something. But the math is still pretty valid, right? So I want to look at this from a slightly different perspective, because when I show this to executives, a lot of times they're like, oh, well, you know, blah, 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 blah. Okay. What if we look at it this way? So this is basically what happens, how long, the duration, does it take to complete 8 hours of work? And I'm doing the air quotes on the 8 hours of work thing because who the hell knows what is 8 hours of work, right? Like 8 hours of work for me might be 3 hours of work for you. Right? I don't know, but we'll just use a standard of 8 hours of work, right? If you're on 1 project and you have lost 20% to, stuff and things, that 8 hours of work is going to take you 10. 2 projects, 3, 4. Basically, once you're on 5 projects, 1 day's worth of work will take you infinity to complete, right? Based on this. But that's not the only thing. So this is just that if you're on multiple projects. But there's another problem with this because resources mentality, and I see this one even more often in organizations, and this is this idea of we've got to keep everybody loaded, right? We need to have people loaded to 100% because, well, it's not good use of our money. If I'm paying you, and I'm paying you a good salary, by the way, if I'm paying you, you should be giving me 100% of your attention when you're here. So I'm going to make you be 100% utilized. And work is variable. The difficulty of a task from one task to another varies. The amount of time that task might take varies. The type of thinking that is required varies. Whenever you have variability in a system, you have to have slack. If you don't have slack, the system jams, right? So the common analogy is a highway. If you're on a highway and it is 100% utilized, meaning there is absolutely no space whatsoever, what's happening? It's a traffic jam, right? Fundamentally, it becomes a parking lot. That is 100% utilization. Nothing moves. Now, theoretically, you could load that highway to 100% and it could all move at the exact same speed. And I've had people make that argument. You're right. There is now 0 variability in the system. Not one of those vehicles can go any faster or any slower. Cannot veer to the right, cannot veer to the left, cannot in any way alter their trajectory. And then that's possible, right? 0 variability is the only time that 100% utilization actually works. Otherwise, it causes jams. And that's exactly what happens in our work. When we are 100% utilized, our performance graph starts to look something like this. The amount of time it takes a task at 100% utilization is exponentially higher than at 90%, which is twice what it is at 80%, right? So as we kind of go through this, right around 40, 50% utilization, you start to see a little bit of drag sometimes in organizations. But as you get to 80 and 90, it's a significant spike where the throughput actually goes down. So when we start loading people to 100% allocation, we're actually slowing them down. They are going to get less and less and less done. And then we marry these two concepts together, and we start saying, okay, here's 8 hours of work on one project with utilization. Now, we can see down here there's a bit of a drop. That's because at 10% utilization, you can't actually get all the work done, right, in the amount of time, right? But eventually, whoop, okay. 2 projects. 3, 4, 5 projects, 100% utilization. You will get nothing done ever, right? What Stable Teams is solving for these organizations is this problem. It is solving because resources, right? That's what it actually solved. It stopped managers from saying, okay, you're going to be on this project, and this project, and I need you 33.33% on each of them, or I need you 40% here, 40% here, 20% there, or whatever, right? It stopped that from happening, and it stopped organizations from assembling and disassembling and new assembling teams based on some project or some whim, right? It allowed us to say, this is a stable team, leave them alone, stop doing that bullshit. If they don't have enough work for their front-end developer, they will figure out how to make that work. They will maybe have the front-end developer work on some more documentation. Maybe that person will pair with the back-end developer so they can start to skill up in that area. But this stable team will figure that out on their own, leave them alone. So that's what it actually solved. But stable teams started to create a new phenomena inside organizations. We started creating these tiny little boxes, right? We made a new form of silos. So at one point, we had maybe all of the DBAs reported into one structure, and all of the API developers reported into another one, and all of the front end reported into another one. And we had all of these little weird silos, right? And we tried to figure out how to flow work through each of those little silos. We said, well, that's not working. And we kept shoving people around. And eventually we said, okay, standing teams, stable teams, every skill you need is on that same team. And this is working really well. But we started creating these little tiny silos, right? Because now these teams start to associate with themselves more than they do with others, right? New learning is happening within each box, but it's not necessarily getting out. So this team figures out that maybe their Git flow was a little too complicated. And so they streamline it, and now they're just going off a trunk. Crazy. And it's working really well for them. But no other team in the organization knows about that. No other team in the organization learns about that, right? And these teams start to create their own subcultures, some of which are very toxic. And I've seen this in organizations where I actually call it like the cult of personality. You'll see these teams where the team itself is awesome. Everybody gets along. Everybody works really well. Man, they crank out work, and everybody else hates working with them. Doesn't want to have to depend on them for anything. Doesn't want to even have to communicate with them because they are abusive to everyone in the organization except themselves, right? And I call it cult of personality because typically those teams have some type of ego-driven leader who benefits greatly from having that team be unbelievably loyal to him or her, right? And so they create this dynamic where the team loves them and they're always protecting the team. And so they create all these, adverse relationships, right? And then what happens is organizations grow, and we start to realize that like the monolith just isn't working anymore for us. Like we proved the market and the product is good, and now we got to figure out something else to do. So what are we going to do? We're going to break it down into some kind of services, maybe even microservices. And every team now owns a service, and all of a sudden you've got this organization that is growing, and this new problem is actually getting worse. Right? This is just another implementation of Conway's Law, all right, so how many of you are familiar with Conway's Law, by the way? All right, so yeah, it's kind of a thing that like most of us know at this point, right? But paraphrasing Conway's Law, the systems that we produce are a reflection of the organizational structure that produces them. So when we organize in certain ways, wherever the seams are between teams, between groups, that is where the highest number of bugs, defects, issues occur. Not just in software. Conway's Law actually was later realized for software. It was originally applied to, I believe, military tanks, trying to figure out why tanks consistently failed in certain ways. And after a comprehensive study, realized that all of the failure points mapped back to communication points on teams, right? And then looking at other systems, realizing this is universal. This is just kind of how it works. It's also how it works in software. So as we get into these micro teams, right, and they're highly insular, and there isn't sharing across them, the organization isn't growing, isn't moving, isn't actually advancing as well. And you start to see all these really strange behaviors. The other challenge becomes, let's just pick any one of these teams, right? Let's say this team here. When this team first forms, their responsibility is to launch into a new vertical, right? We are going to come up with a new product that is similar to our current offering, but will gain us access into a different market. So I was a global director of engineering culture for Groupon for a number of years. And the original coupons thing was great, and it worked until we screwed it up. But we wanted to launch into other markets. And so when we wanted to get into, say, travel, right? Vacation packages. We peeled the team off and we said, you guys are responsible for figuring this out and capturing this market. So when we started, this is a team full of people who absolutely loved lean startup-y type things, right? Try a little thing, a little bit of Mechanical Turk, just throw it out there, see what happens, get some feedback, run an A/B test. Boom, 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 boom. Moving fast, breaking things, right? Oh, that didn't work, this will work. Let's try this, let's try that. And they got to a certain point where they're like, oh, people are starting to buy this, right? What happens next? What happens next is, okay, people are starting to buy this. We've kind of proven it out. We should probably pull the reins back on the and start actually stabilizing. But this team doesn't like doing that kind of work. And they're still responsible for travel. So they're still going to keep doing what they like to do. So it turns out that the product itself actually wants different skills, different people, different capabilities as the product matures. So we introduced a new problem with this stable teams concept. And that was that teams were not necessarily well outfitted for, and a bunch of people said, oh, but they could have learned to do that. Well, sure, we can learn to do that. That's true. But if I really like to play basketball and what the team needs is baseball, why am I going to stay there? Right? Yeah, I could learn to play baseball, but I don't like doing that. It's not a matter of skill, it's a matter of desire. Feathers talks about this quite a bit. There's a lot of words on the screen. Feel free to read them if you want to. I'm going to redact this down a little bit. What he basically says is, look, none of this stuff is static, right? None of our projects are static. right? It's actually very fluid, and if you have the ability to reteam, then you're able to do this sort of thing consistently. You're able to actually move people around in ways that serve the needs of the product, right? So we're starting to realize that reteaming is actually a good idea. The question is, how do you do it? So in the past, the way that we did it was management got together in a room and they, I don't know, man, they threw names in a pile and they drew them out and they negotiated. And then they came up with like, these are the new teams. And you came in Monday morning and it was announced, these are the new teams. And then we wondered why things didn't work very well. But some other organizations have started to figure this out, right? How can we actually reteam in a healthy way? So one of them I want to talk about a little bit is Valve Software. I think a few years ago their handbook came out. It was very clever, a great read, and it really kind of like made its way around the software community. They have this idea of cabals. And basically what these are is they're multidisciplinary project teams. So same fundamental concept that we're seeing in Agile or whatever, right? Take everybody that you need, put them on a single team, right? What happens is they completely self-organize into these basically temporary groups. They see all of these groups as ephemeral. They will live as long as they need to live, and they will disappear when they are no longer needed. And they are, for the most part, entirely trusting the doers to decide, the people that do the work. Now, in a lot of organizations, when I talk about this type of thing, this idea of very high autonomy, what if, so at Valve, at least the theory is, and I haven't spoken to anyone that has said like, yes, that is actually reality, I've seen that happen. I have only heard it third hand. But you could be working on a project on Friday afternoon. Friday night, you go out with a few friends from work for drinks. One of them is talking about the project they're on. You're like, your project sounds pretty cool. So Monday morning, you come in. You release the lock on your desk. You roll it over to your friend's area. Lock, pull down the power, and you are now on that team. Done. There's no paperwork, there's no management approval, there's nothing, right? You just move. And the fear in a lot of organizations has been, well, if we do that, everyone's going to leave all of the boring work, and everyone's going to want to go to the sexy work. They're all going to want to do the new, interesting stuff, and no one's going to want to do the boring things. And it just turns out that that's not actually true. If you actually implement this, that's not what happens. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, what you think is exciting and sexy, somebody else doesn't ever want to have to do. So, we talked about the one team that like what they really love to do is that lean startup-y kind of stuff, right? There are other teams of people, what they really love to do is actually turn it into a rock solid, scalable, performing platform, right? Two totally different things. What each of them thinks is exciting, differs. The other thing is that even for us as individuals, our needs and desires change. I've seen plenty of engineers who have come into an organization, have skyrocketed themselves into some position of like, man, she is amazing. She gets a ton of work done. She's here long hours. She's, just absolutely nailing it. We made her the lead in this team. 5 years in, she's starting a family. And what ends up happening is she leaves the organization because there's expectations of her behavior, and there's no place for her to go within this organization. And I see the same thing with men, right? They come in and they actually, escalate in some way, and then they start a family, and now it's 40-hour week is good. And if I can come in after a sleepless night, and I can pick a ticket off of a stack, and I can actually get it all the way to done and check that in by the end of the day, that's a good day for me, right? That's a reality. So what we actually want and need changes. So it turns out that these things actually work. One of the other arguments that I hear about especially this type of thing here, is, and I actually had this, so at Groupon, one of the first things that I introduced was an internal transfer procedure. The reason that we did it was interviewing a bunch of the developers. There were a lot of complaints. There were people who were actually leaving the organization because they felt that they couldn't move from team to team, right? And so I went to the executives and I said, many people are leaving the organization because they feel as though they cannot move from team to team. To which the VP said, well, that is patently false. And I said, no, I don't think you heard me. They feel as though they cannot move from team to team. You cannot tell me that is true or false. It is their feelings, not yours. And we have an option here. There's basically two things you can do. You can go out there and you can lecture them. You can chastise them for not knowing that they are in fact allowed to move from team to team, but maybe they should just try a little harder. Or we could change our behavior such that it's no longer a question. And as we started to actually design this procedure for being able to move from team to team, one of the concerns that came up was, well, you know, there's a couple of teams where, like, everyone's going to leave the team. I said, well, why is that? I said, the manager's really not very good. So, okay, I'm just going to reiterate what you just told me. You as the leader of this organization are telling me that you know you have bad managers, and your solution to that is to force people to stay on their team? Oh yeah, that's actually kind of a good point. Okay. And what happened when we actually put this in place was there was a flurry of change on the teams, and then it stabilized out. None of the teams were understaffed. If they were, it wasn't for very long. Then it worked out perfectly fine. Spotify has a slightly different model. By the way, if you guys if you're still talking about the Spotify model and you think it's the white paper that they wrote, many years ago, this is not what they look like today, because they have grown, they have scaled, they have had to change several times. The Spotify model actually is not squads, chapters, guilds, blah, 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 blah. The Spotify model, if anything, is the way that they continually experiment internally with their structures and, adjust and adapt as their context changes. If you want to follow a model, follow that, not some static moment in time, that worked for them at a specific size in a specific context. But regardless, even in this kind of in this structure, which is one that most folks know, they allow for easy transfer between roles within tribes. There's knowledge share across guilds, which also leads sometimes to changes across actual tribes themselves. So they actually have an entire way of kind of moving people around. So in their concept, the team is static in terms of we have a group of people that are responsible for this thing, but the team is not static in terms of who is on that team at any specific point in time, right? So the responsibility stays with the team. Who's on the team is relatively fluid. All right, so if you actually want to do reteaming in your organization, what do you need to have in place? And I think this is interesting, right? So there are basically 4 factors that lead to better team performance and collective satisfaction. And these are the things that I think any leader needs to be focused on. And those are autonomy, connection, excellence, and diversity. All right, now, how many of you are familiar with Daniel Pink's drive? Right, so he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? And I like Pink's work. I've read almost all of the same research papers that he has, and a few and several that I think he probably hasn't. Drive, autonomy, mastery, purpose, speaks specifically to individual, right? You as an individual in knowledge work, in thought work, what do you need to be happy? You need autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, connection, excellence, diversity is what teams need. So there is a difference here, right? Autonomy is about being able to actually have influence over your day-to-day work, freedom to choose how the work is done, freedom to choose what team you're on, right? Connection is connection to the purpose and cause. So what's the organization actually doing, right? Why are we here? It's also connection to one another. So having empathy for other members of your team, it's about high communication. We look at Spotify, right? And they had their guilds, which is a way of actually sharing knowledge across chapters and tribes. I introduced into organizations something that we call interest leagues. It's a very similar concept. Actually, guilds and interest leagues, we were developing them at basically the same time, and Anders Iverson and I had an opportunity to chat for quite a while about like how they were working at Spotify and how it was working at Groupon, and we both kind of made adjustments to what we were doing based on each other's learning. So the concepts are very similar. Excellence. So this is about personal growth and quality work, but it's also about the work that we're actually producing and the ability to actually see progress towards both of those things. In a lot of organizations, we don't measure things like the quality of the code. We don't actually show people the return on investment of the thing that they're building, right? We might show some vanity metrics, but excellence is about actually getting the information you need to know that you're doing your job well. And then diversity is probably the most important one, but this is not diversity of visual differentiators. This is actually diversity of thought. It is the different perspectives, different experiences, different backgrounds, different mindsets, different skill sets coming together onto a single team that actually makes the difference. Right now, diversity of thought is a hard thing to go after because you can't see it, touch it, or feel it. It turns out that if you are deliberate about hiring for visual differentiators, you will get diversity of thought, both in that when you add people from different backgrounds to a team, you automatically have diversity of thought. But something very interesting, there's a study that's been done. If you take a team of, I'll say, men, all of whom have very similar backgrounds, maybe they all went to the same school, they're all in the same profession, they've all worked for this same company, so these are really kind of, like clones of each other, right? And you add to that team a woman who comes from the same economic background, went to the same school, has the same career, is basically the same, except for some very clear differentiators. The men on that team will automatically change their behavior and they will think differently because they think she thinks differently, even if she doesn't. So the point only being that when we add someone who doesn't look like us to a team, the team's behavior automatically changes. People start to think differently. All right, so let's look at some reteaming patterns, right? So we've got autonomy, connection, excellence, diversity. We know that we actually want to reteam because we know that stable teams, maybe they solve the problem, but hopefully that problem doesn't exist anymore. So what can we do? So there's a few of these that I'm going to share with you. There's an excellent book that is written by Heidi Helfland, and she's still working on some final touches of it, but you can get it on EPUB, on LeanPub, sorry, called Dynamic Reteaming, where she has studied a ton of organizations that are doing this type of stuff, and she's actually come up with a bunch of different patterns. So, first one, socialization. The socialization pattern is pretty easy, right? Here, what happens is a team adds a new member and makes a concerted effort to actually onboard them and get them acclimated to the team. So, many organizations, what you see is there's an onboarding process that is completely separate from the actual work, right? And it's pretty general. It's enough to like get you your user ID and show you where the wiki is and maybe get your workstation set up for general work. But then when you join your actual team, there's all this new stuff that you have to learn, and you just kind of have to learn it through osmosis because there's no process. Socialization is an easy way to basically say, all right, there's an onboarding for this particular team, right? It allows us to actually absorb people more readily, and in having that, we are now able to actually add people to the team much more rapidly. So this actually fosters fluidity. I can move from team to team and know that I'm supported actually onboarding to that team. Another very common pattern that we see is mitosis. So what happens here, so we talked about, the travel team, right? And the way that was actually executed at the time was, we need to get into travel. So we'll take a couple of engineers, a lead from this team because we think she's really awesome, and we're going to take, one of the back-end folks from this team because, we think that he's got the right kind of skills to do this. And then we're basically going to hire up everybody else, and we're going to make a whole new team, and we're going to do a whole new thing, right? That means that team has to come together, learn all about each other, learn the environment, etc. Mitosis, what you do is you say, okay, we have an existing team. They have a socialization capability. So we're going to keep adding members to that team until it just gets a little bit too big, and then we'll split it into two teams. We're not going to decide how it's split until the moment of split comes. And ideally what we're going to do is we're going to allow that team to self-select into the two new teams, right? What we've done here is we're basically, we're extending the culture because by adding people to a team, they're learning very quickly, okay, this is kind of how it works. This is where stuff is. This is where I go for this. This person knows this. They're kind of my go-to for that. So then when the team actually splits, you've got two healthy, high-functioning teams right out of the gate. And this is a really good way for organizations to actually grow, right? Have teams that are basically your incubators for launching new teams, as opposed to hire and hope, right? Another pattern that we see quite often with reteaming, and something people don't think about as reteaming, but it actually is, right, is called the volunteer fire department. Something comes up, there's a need. Once we solve this thing, it's going to go away. People temporarily leaving the team that they're on to create some temporary task force, take care of that problem, solve that issue, run that spike, do those sets of experiments, and then go back to their regular teams. So this might be because there's a production outage. It might be because we are investigating a partnership with some other company, and we need to really explore their APIs and decide we actually want to do this, or whatever it might be, right? But just having a team temporarily come together and then disband once that need has been solved. Another one that I like to see in organizations is the trading places. Here what you're doing is you're actually swapping team members for some period of time, right? Two teams, swap members for 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever that might be. We look at, some organizations now have this idea of tours of duty. So you are on some team, and your basic contract with that team is for 3 months or 6 months. At the end of that time period, you might move to another team, or you may re-up with this one. But every 3 months or every 6 months, you have an opportunity to make a switch. Trading places, the idea here is now we're actually sharing knowledge back and forth across these two teams, right? I'm going to spend a little bit of time with that other team. I'm going to figure out, I'm going to learn about, man, you know what? Actually, the way that they do their stand-ups, they don't even ask the 3 questions. That's interesting. They just look at the board and they talk about the work that's in front of them right now. And it goes a lot faster, and their communication is higher, and they're collaborating more, and it actually takes less time. So you go back to your team and you tell them about that cool thing the other team was doing, and maybe we should try this. So it's a way of just getting knowledge shared across the organizations. I want to have a little bit of time for Q&A, so we're almost done here. Friend of mine, we were talking about this, and I think this quote is actually in Heidi Helfland's book as well, but Nayan Hajawala, in talking about this, he said, look, man, reteaming is inevitable. You might as well get good at it, right? The reality of it is, for us, It's happening all the time in all of our organizations, either because it's forced or because people are opting out, so new members are coming in. It's going to happen anyway. Let's just get good at it. And the thing for me maybe is, maybe if we really think about it and we realize the truth, there is no team. This idea, maybe in and of itself, is completely flawed. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope this is helpful and informative. Thoughts, questions? I think we've got 10 minutes maybe.
If you suggest that people can move freely between teams, how many get scared? Totally scared.
So if we suggest that people can move freely from team to team, who gets scared?
Company.
The company gets scared. Sure. But why? Right? What about that scares them? Deadlines. They think they won't get met. Yeah. Sure. I mean, but this is the same reason that they allocate people at 100%, right? It's the same reason because they may want to make sure the deadline gets hit, right? And it's actually counterproductive. You're right. There are plenty of organizations that would be afraid of that idea, and it doesn't have to be 100% fluidity, right? It doesn't have to be like Valve, right? I think that's an extreme end of things. At Groupon, what we did was, as a member of a team, as long as you were not on a performance improvement plan, which was a rare occurrence there anyway, you could move from team to team, but there was a process for it. So, one, identifying the team that you want to move to, talking to them to make sure that there's actually availability and interest, right? So they have a slot, they need the help, they want you on the team. And then talking with your manager and that team's manager to create a schedule. So what we did, all we really did was, people were always allowed to move. The challenge was, you would go to your manager and say, I'm thinking I want to move to the, I think I want to move to the live team. I really like what they're doing. I think really the live venues is a great thing. I want to move over there. And your manager would go, yeah, now's not a good time. Well, what does that mean to you, right? So when is a good time, right? That's no. It's not what the manager means. What the manager means is, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I'm not sure I want to talk about it. What you heard was, nope. And so then you leave the company, and the problem they were trying to avoid happens anyway, and, right? So we moved the question from if to when. It was no longer a question of if you could move. Yes, you can. The question is, when can you move? And that helped to solve that. So it wasn't just people going all over the place, right? So it might be that you can't move until this project has hit this deadline. Now, you may disagree with that, and you might still opt to leave the organization, but we're at least having decent discussions now, and it helped quite a bit.
Imagine that you have a company with a number of teams, and some teams are doing great, and everyone sees that they are productive, innovative, and having a lot of fun. And some teams have to do some support that nobody really wants. And if you allow this movement, then of course this will have to crash under itself.
Right. So that's another common argument, right? So the argument basically being that, like, hey, you got this company, there's a couple of teams that are doing really awesome stuff, it's very innovative, you can see that they're high performing, and there's other teams that basically all they're doing is maintenance, and it's kind of boring, right? And if you allow for this fluidity, then everyone's going to leave the maintenance teams. That is a common argument. It turns out that when you actually give people that kind of autonomy, that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen for a number of reasons. There are some people who will look at it and go, well, crap. If somebody doesn't do this maintenance stuff, we're all in trouble. And they will step up and they will take the maintenance stuff, and they will actually find high personal value, right? They will find intrinsic motivation in knowing that they are the pillar for this organization. Right? So there are people who will actually step up because it's intrinsically interesting to them. There are other people who will want that role because there's other things going on in their life right now. Your parents have taken ill, and they are in a home, and you want to be there for them in the morning, and you want to be there for them in the evening. And so the high-paced, innovative stuff is just a little too much for you to actually deal with right now. Again, it's kind of the same situation. Being able to come in, pull a ticket, get it done, that's a great day, right? If I can actually, like, when I close that laptop at 5, not have to think about it again until I come in the next day, and whatever is in front of me is new, fresh, and I know I can do it in a single day, that allows me to do what else I need to do. So just it has worked out that those fears I have yet to see realized in organizations. And typically, if there is a mass exodus from one team to some other area, it's not about the work, it's about the leadership, right? Maybe it's about the way that work is being managed or executed, and if we switched that, then the problem would go away. Yeah.
So you said like the Spotify teams that are trying to do different stuff for organizing themselves. Do you know any kind of like quantification or measurements you can do for when you try new types of organizational structures? If you're succeeding, or what are you want to look at?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question, right? So as you're kind of going through this, what types of things do you actually want to measure? What do you want to look at? One of the things that I've used several times is doing employee engagement surveys, so micro surveys, usually trying to keep it to a handful of questions, no more than maybe like 12 to 15 questions, and sending those out 1 or 2 at a time. So it's really super easy to actually answer those. And what we're looking for is things like, do you know what is expected of you at work? Do you feel like someone is actually helping to move your career along? Do you feel like your coworkers are committed to doing quality work? Those types of things, right? And if we make adjustments to the organization and we see some of those things slide, that like people don't feel as engaged to the work or don't feel as much, like things are going well, that's certainly one measure we want to look at. Obviously, another thing we want to be able to look at is is the actual throughput of the organization, how much stuff is actually getting out, is the adoption rate of that work going up or down? So, it depends on the size of the organization. Groupon, we were large enough that we could actually run multivariate testing and get to statistical significance in a relatively short period of time. That is a whole talk in and of itself, A/B and multivariate testing, and when are they actually valid and when are they actually misleading? But we were able to do that at Groupon and actually could see that when we made certain types of switches, did we actually get better uptick out of our performance or out of our experiments or worse, and kind of, so we could actually see the team's performance from engagement, satisfaction, internal code quality, throughput in terms of lead time, cycle time, and actual product quality in terms of adoption in the market and growth, right? So we had all of these measures that we could look at, and they're all this kind of, the levers are a little complicated because everything is a trailing indicator, right? So you adjust this, and it might take weeks before you see a change in the measurement, but those were all the kinds of things that we were measuring, and it was definitely helpful. Yeah.
Do you have any experience when the team doesn't want a new guy to join? So let's say that he's a developer that writes crappy tests.
Oh, yeah. So no, that's actually a thing, right? So the question is there, what do you do when the team doesn't want someone to join? Don't let them join. I know that sounds harsh, right? But that's, there's a balance between creating these kind of micro cultures, that become highly insular, right? So you want to make sure that you are adding, different people with different perspectives, different backgrounds to those teams, and keeping that, fresh, right? You don't want to get to kind of a groupthink sort of situation. At the same time, if the team has an agreed set of standards that, that they hold themselves accountable to, and they have evidence or reason to believe that this new team member is not going to, live up to that standard, if it's not someone that you would hire, don't hire them. Right? A lot of organizations actually run internal job markets, and you are basically applying for that role on that team, and you may or may not get it for any number of reasons. And it might actually be that that team feels that your technical marks aren't aligned with what they hold as a standard, even though the organization as a whole did in fact hire you. So yeah, I would say if there's a reason the team doesn't want the person on the team, then it shouldn't happen. And it doesn't have to be, brutal by any means, right? It can be just an honest conversation. So I think we're right at 10 o'clock. I will be around for the rest of the day. I'm glad to chat with folks about this or other things, software and team related. Again, thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.